The distant wail of a coyote pierced the night as Winifred Caldwell stared at the empty cupboard, her trembling fingers gripping the wooden door so tightly her knuckles turned white. 3 months a widow, and the cruel reality of her situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The small ranch outside Kearney, Nebraska would be her salvation or her ruin, and today the scales seemed tipped heavily toward the latter. The year was 1876, and Kearney was growing faster than most prairie towns, with the railroad bringing new possibilities and people. But none of that mattered when your husband died suddenly, leaving you with a half-built dream and not nearly enough knowledge to keep it alive. "We'll make do," she whispered to the empty kitchen, the words a prayer she repeated daily. Her husband Thomas had been taken suddenly by pneumonia after falling through the ice while rescuing their neighbor's child last winter. The town had mourned him properly, he'd been well liked, but memories were short when there was a living to be made. Winifred brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face and straightened her back. At 26, she was still young but felt decades older. She had refused every pitying offer that had come her way, offers of marriage from men who saw her 40 acres as more appealing than her company. Offers of charity that would have bound her in invisible chains of obligation. "I won't be anyone's burden," she declared to the silence of her home, her voice echoing against the log walls Thomas had raised with his own hands. She'd sell eggs if she had to, take in mending, anything but admit defeat. The first light of dawn was breaking across the plains as Winifred stepped onto her porch, wrapping her shawl tightly against the early spring chill. The sight that greeted her made her gasp. There, on her front step, sat a burlap sack. Inside, she found flour, salt, coffee, and beans enough to feed her for at least 2 weeks. Beside it was a smaller package with seed potatoes and onion sets. Winifred looked around frantically, scanning the horizon for any sign of the benefactor, but the prairie stretched empty in all directions. Pride rose like bile in her throat. She hadn't asked for this, didn't want it, yet the practical side of her knew she couldn't afford to refuse it, not if she wanted to survive. Who would do this? She wondered aloud as she carried the provisions inside, torn between gratitude and humiliation. She decided then that she would find who had left the goods and pay them back, every penny with interest if need be. What Winifred couldn't see was the lone figure watching from a stand of cottonwoods half a mile away. Lucas Xavier removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair as he watched her disappear inside with the supplies. His expression was a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "Take it, Mrs. Caldwell," he murmured, though there was no way she could hear. "Just take the damn help." Lucas was a man of few words but more principles. At 32, he'd seen enough of life to know when someone was too stubborn for their own good. He'd known Thomas Caldwell not well, but enough to respect the man. When he'd heard the widow was struggling but refusing all assistance, something in him had recognized that particular brand of pride. He'd been there himself once. Lucas mounted his horse and headed back to his own homestead 10 miles west. He had work to do and misses. Caldwell had given him something to think about. A woman who refused charity even when she needed it was either foolish or fiercely independent. He suspected the latter, and it intrigued him more than he cared to admit. As days passed, Winifred asked discreet questions around town, trying to identify her mysterious benefactor. No one admitted to leaving the supplies. In fact, most seemed genuinely surprised to hear someone had done such a thing. "Maybe it was the Millers," suggested Dorothy Harper, the general store owner's wife, as Winifred purchased a spool of thread with precious pennies. "They're always helping folks in need." "I'm not in need," Winifred replied sharply, then softened her tone. "I mean, I'm managing just fine. I simply want to repay whoever left those things." Dorothy looked skeptical but didn't argue. "Well, I'll keep my ears open. Word travels fast in Kearney." Not fast enough, apparently. A week later, Winifred woke to find a cord of split firewood stacked neatly by her door and 2 young chickens in a small crate. No note, no footprints, nothing to indicate who had left them. Lucas watched from his hiding place as Winifred discovered his latest offering. Her reaction was not what he expected. Rather than relief, her expression showed frustration and was that anger. She looked around with such intensity that he ducked deeper into the shadows of the tree line, even though he was too far away to be spotted. "I don't need your pity," she shouted to the empty landscape, hands on her hips. "Whoever you are, stop this right now." Lucas couldn't help but smile. She had spirit, this widow woman. Most would have simply accepted the help gratefully, perhaps with embarrassment, but not her. She was offended by it. What Lucas didn't know was how deeply the gesture cut into Winifred's sense of self. Every anonymous gift was a reminder that someone thought she couldn't manage. Every silent act of charity was proof that the world saw her as helpless without a husband. Late that afternoon, Winifred hitched her mare to the wagon and drove into town, determined to find answers. She parked outside the sheriff's office and marched inside, her boots striking the wooden floorboards with purpose. Sheriff James Taggart looked up from his desk, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Mrs. Caldwell, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Someone is leaving things at my property," she stated without preamble. "I wanted to stop." Taggart leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. "Things? What kind of things?" "Food, firewood, chickens, for heaven's sake. I want to know who's doing it so I can tell them to stop." The sheriff chuckled, then quickly sobered when he saw her expression. "Mrs. Caldwell, most folks would consider themselves lucky to have such a secret admirer." "It's not admiration, it's pity, and I won't be pitied." Winifred placed her hands on his desk, leaning forward. "Will you help me or not?" "Not much I can do about someone leaving gifts," Taggart replied. "No law against generosity." "Then I'll find them myself," she declared, turning to leave. "Mrs. Caldwell," the sheriff called after her, his tone gentler. "Sometimes pride can be a heavier burden than accepting a helping hand." She paused at the door. "My pride is all I have left, Sheriff. Good day." As she stepped outside, Winifred nearly collided with a tall man in a worn leather vest and dusty Stetson. "Excuse me, madam," he said, tipping his hat and stepping aside. "Entirely my fault," she replied automatically, barely looking at him as she rushed to her wagon. Lucas Xavier watched her go, noting the determined set of her shoulders and the way she snapped the reins perhaps a little harder than necessary. He entered the sheriff's office, curious about what had her so riled up. "Lucas," Sheriff Taggart greeted him. "Just the man I wanted to see. Got a telegram from Omaha about those horses you're expecting." Lucas nodded his thanks but gestured toward the door. "What's troubling the widow Caldwell?" Taggart sighed. "Someone's been leaving supplies at her place. She's taking it as an insult rather than a kindness." Lucas kept his face carefully neutral. "Is that so? Proud woman, too proud for her own good if you ask me." Taggart shook his head. "Reminds me of someone else I know." He gave Lucas a pointed look. Lucas ignored the implication. "The telegram." As the sheriff handed him the message, Lucas made a decision. If Winifred Caldwell was so determined to reject charity, perhaps she would accept a business proposition instead. The next morning, Lucas rode to the Caldwell homestead with a proposition in mind. He found Winifred in her garden, struggling to turn over the hard spring soil with a shovel. She was dressed in a simple cotton dress, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back with a faded ribbon. She looked up as his horse approached, immediately dropping the shovel and reaching for something beside her, a rifle. He realized with surprise. "State your business," she called, not raising the weapon but keeping her hand on it. Lucas reined his horse to a stop at a respectful distance. "Lucas Xavier, madam. I own the Double Bar Ranch west of here." He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "I knew your husband slightly, came to offer my condolences and a proposition." Winifred's expression remained wary. "What kind of proposition?" "I'm expanding my herd this spring. Need help with various tasks, mending fences, branding calves, that sort of thing. Thought maybe you might be interested in earning some money." She frowned, clearly suspicious. "And why would you offer me such work? I'm not a ranch hand." Lucas shrugged. You have a reputation for being capable. And I pay fair wages for honest work. I see. Winifred studied him, trying to determine if this was yet another form of charity. And what exactly would these duties entail? For now, I need help with some mending saddles, harnesses. I heard you're skilled with a needle. Later, when branding starts, could use an extra hand keeping records. He paused. Nothing you can't handle, I expect, pride warred with practicality in her expression. Finally, she nodded. I can mend leather work. My father taught me. But I'll not accept charity disguised as employment, Mr. Xavier. Wouldn't dream of offering it, Mrs. Caldwell. This is business, plain and simple. A faint smile touched her lips. Then we understand each other. When would you like me to start? Got some things in my saddlebags now if you're not too busy. He gestured to the garden. Though it looks like you've got your hands full. Winifred glanced at her half-turned garden. This can wait. Come inside and we'll discuss your terms. As he followed her into the small cabin, Lucas took note of the space. It was modest but meticulously clean. The mysterious supplies he'd left were nowhere in sight, but he noticed the chickens pecking in a makeshift pen outside. She'd used what he'd given her, despite her protests. That was something. Coffee, she offered, moving to the stove. Thank you, madam. He removed his hat, setting it on his knee as he took a seat at the small table. Winifred busied herself with the coffee pot, grateful for the moment to collect her thoughts. Something about Lucas Xavier seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. He wasn't a regular in town as far as she knew. Sugar? She asked, setting a chipped cup before him. Black is fine. He took a sip, watching her over the rim. Good coffee. Thank you. She sat across from him, her posture straight as a ramrod. Now, about your proposition. What are your terms? Lucas laid out a fair wage for her mending work, adding that he would provide materials and collect the finished pieces weekly. He also mentioned the possibility of more work as spring progressed, carefully framing everything as business rather than charity. Winifred listened intently, asking pointed questions about expectations and timelines. When he finished, she nodded once. Those terms are acceptable. I'll begin today if you have items that need immediate attention. I do. Lucas retrieved several worn leather pieces from his saddlebags. Nothing urgent, but the sooner the better. As she examined the items, her expression softened slightly. This is quality leatherwork. It deserves proper repair. Thought you'd appreciate that, he said, watching her capable hands assess the damage. Your father was a saddle maker, she looked up, surprised. Yes, in Missouri. How did you know? Lucas shrugged. Just a guess from how you handle the leather. In truth, he'd heard about her background from the blacksmith in town, who had mentioned that the widow Caldwell had occasionally helped him with fine leatherwork. It was one of the reasons he'd thought of this arrangement. They settled the details of their agreement, and Lucas prepared to leave. At the door, he paused. Mrs. Caldwell, one more thing. Yes, that garden of yours soils hard this time of year. I could send one of my hands over with a plow horse to turn it proper. Her expression immediately closed. That won't be necessary, Mr. Xavier. I can manage my own garden. Not charity, he clarified quickly. Call it an advance on future work. You'll earn it back soon enough. Winifred hesitated, clearly torn. The garden needed to be planted soon if she was to have vegetables this summer, and she had been struggling with the hard ground. Very well, she said finally, but I'll keep track of the debt. Lucas nodded, hiding his satisfaction. I wouldn't expect anything less, Mrs. Caldwell. As he rode away, he couldn't help but look back. She stood on her porch, watching him go, a puzzling mixture of resolve and vulnerability in her stance. Lucas found himself looking forward to their next meeting more than was strictly professional. What he didn't realize was that Winifred was studying him just as carefully, wondering why a successful rancher would seek out a widow for mending work when there were plenty of more experienced hands available in town. Something didn't quite add up, and Winifred Caldwell was determined to figure out what it was. 2 days later, Lucas's ranch hand arrived with a plow horse as promised. Winifred worked alongside the young man, directing where the furrows should go and following behind to drop in precious seeds. By afternoon, her garden was properly prepared for the growing season, and she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. One less impossible task to manage alone. Over the next weeks, a pattern emerged. Lucas would bring leather work, they would discuss terms, and he would leave with completed pieces from his previous visit. Their conversations grew less formal, though Winifred maintained a certain reserve. Lucas learned she had no family left. Her parents had died years ago, and she had no siblings. She had married Thomas Caldwell after he passed through her Missouri town on a cattle drive. They had settled in Nebraska with dreams of building a prosperous ranch. Thomas had such plans, she told Lucas one day as she worked oil into a repaired bridle. This place was going to be something special. Still could be, Lucas suggested carefully, her hands stilled. Perhaps, but I'm realistic about what I can accomplish alone. Being alone doesn't mean you can't accept help now and then, he ventured, her eyes flashed. I'm not looking for help, Mr. Xavier, just honest work. And I'm providing it, he assured her, but neighbors help neighbors out here, it's how we all survive. She studied him for a moment. Is that what we are, neighbors? I'd like to think so, he replied, meeting her gaze steadily. Something shifted between them in that moment. Not dramatically, but enough that both felt it a possibility opening, a door unlocked if not yet opened. As April turned to May, the mysterious gifts continued to appear at Winifred's door. Sometimes small things, a jar of honey, a sack of cornmeal. Sometimes larger, a repaired fence post, a new well rope installed while she was in town. Each time, she grew more frustrated but also more determined to identify her benefactor. She began watching more carefully, even staying up late in hopes of catching them in the act. But whoever it was proved too clever, always coming when she least expected. One afternoon, Lucas arrived to find Winifred in a particularly dark mood. "Something troubling you, Mrs. Caldwell?" he asked as he handed over a worn saddle for repair. She sighed, running a hand over the leather absently. "Someone continues to leave things at my door. Food, supplies, even repairs around the property." She looked up at him. "It's maddening not knowing who to thank or who to tell to stop." Lucas kept his expression neutral. "Why would you want them to stop?" "Because I haven't asked for help." Her voice rose slightly before she controlled it. "Because every time I find something, it's a reminder that someone believes I can't manage on my own. Or maybe," Lucas suggested quietly, "it's a sign that someone believes you shouldn't have to." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Winifred felt a connection that startled her. There was understanding in his gaze, not pity. "Either way," she said, breaking the moment, "I wish they would show themselves. Maybe they will when the time is right." Winifred gave him a curious look. "You sound as if you know something about it." Lucas smiled enigmatically. "Just speculating. Most people around here have good hearts." As he prepared to leave, Lucas noticed dark clouds building on the horizon. "Looks like we're in for some weather. You might want to secure anything that could blow away." Winifred nodded, her mind already shifting to practical matters. "I'll take care of it. Same time next week, Mr. Xavier." "Lucas," he corrected gently. "After all this time, I think we can dispense with formalities." A slight blush colored her cheeks. "Lucas, then, and I'm Winifred, though most call me Winnie." "Winnie," he repeated, tipping his hat. "Until next week." The storm that night was more severe than expected. Rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled like a banshee. Winifred sat by her fire, worrying about her chickens and the newly sprouted garden. A particularly violent gust rattled the cabin, and she jumped at a loud crash outside. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, ghostly flashes as she peered through the window. The small lean-to where she kept firewood had partially collapsed. In this weather, there was nothing to be done but hope the roof held. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sodden landscape. Winifred stepped outside to assess the damage. The lean-to was indeed damaged, with split logs scattered across the muddy yard. The chicken coop had lost part of its roof, though thankfully the birds inside were unharmed. Worst of all, a large branch had fallen from the old oak tree, crushing a section of her garden fence. Already, she could see rabbits had discovered the breach and were helping themselves to her tender seedlings. Fighting back tears of frustration, Winifred set to work, but the tasks before her seemed insurmountable. The fence needed immediate repair to save her garden, but the lean-to had to be fixed before her firewood was ruined by the next rain. And the chicken coop wouldn't keep predators out with a hole in its roof. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself a moment of despair. Sinking onto the porch steps, she buried her face in her hands and wept for her husband, for her struggling homestead, for her own stubborn pride that had made everything harder than it needed to be. A horse's whicker interrupted her moment of weakness. Looking up, she was startled to see Lucas riding toward her property, leading a second horse pulling a small wagon. Behind him rode two young men she recognized as his ranch hands. She hastily wiped her eyes and stood, smoothing her skirt as they approached. "Morning, Winnie," Lucas called as he dismounted. "Thought you might need some help after that blow last night." He looked around, taking in the damage. "Seems I was right." Pride warred with practicality in her heart. "I can manage," she started to say, but Lucas cut her off. "No one's saying you can't," he said firmly. "But why should you have to do it all alone when there are willing hands to help? We'll have this fixed up in no time with 4 of us working." Before she could protest further, Lucas was directing his men, one to the chicken coop and one to gather the scattered firewood. He himself moved toward the broken fence. "The garden needs saving first," he said to Winifred. "Those rabbits will have it stripped bare by noon." Swallowing her objections, Winifred nodded. "Thank you. I'll get some tools." They worked side by side repairing the fence, their hands occasionally brushing as they held boards in place for nailing. Lucas was efficient and skilled, and despite her initial resistance, Winifred found herself grateful for his help. By midday, the fence was repaired, the lean-to rebuilt stronger than before, and the chicken coop roof patched securely. Lucas sent his men back to the ranch while he stayed to help Winifred replant the damaged sections of her garden. As they worked the soil together, Winifred found herself relaxing in his company. There was something comfortable about Lucas Xavier, a quiet strength that didn't demand attention or gratitude. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked finally, sitting back on her heels and wiping sweat from her brow. Lucas paused, a seedling in his hand. "Is it so hard to believe someone might just want to help?" "Yes," she said honestly. "Most people want something in return." "Maybe I do too," he admitted, planting the seedling carefully. Winifred tensed. "What?" "The satisfaction of doing right by a neighbor." He looked up at her, his eyes serious. "That's all, Winnie, no strings, no obligations." She studied him, searching for deceit and finding none. "I'm not used to that, I know," he resumed, planting. "But you might want to get used to it. That's how things work out here. Today I help you, tomorrow you help someone else. Circle keeps going." They finished the garden in companionable silence. As Lucas prepared to leave, Winifred invited him to stay for supper, a simple meal of beans and cornbread, but offered with genuine gratitude. "I'd be honored," Lucas said, removing his hat as he followed her inside. Over supper, their conversation flowed more easily than ever before. Lucas told stories of his years driving cattle from Texas before settling in Nebraska. Winifred spoke of her childhood in Missouri, learning leatherwork at her father's side while her mother taught her the domestic arts. "How did you end up here?" Lucas asked, accepting a second helping of cornbread. "Nebraska's a long way from Missouri." Winifred smiled at the memory. "Thomas stopped in our town during a cattle drive. He was charming, full of dreams about the land up here, said a person could build something from nothing if they had the will." Her smile faded slightly. "He was right about that, at least. He sounds like a good man." He was. She met Lucas's eyes, but not a practical one. He had big visions but sometimes missed the details. This place, she gestured around them, was going to be a showpiece ranch, but he died before the foundation was properly laid. Lucas nodded, understanding. And you've been trying to build on that foundation ever since. Trying and mostly failing, she admitted with a rueful laugh, but I'm too stubborn to give up. Stubborn isn't always bad, Lucas said, his voice warm. Gets things done when others might quit. As darkness fell, Lucas reluctantly rose to leave. At the door, he turned to face her. Winnie, there's something I should tell you, her heart skipped unexpectedly. Yes, he hesitated, then seemed to change his mind. Just that, if you need help again, don't wait for a storm to ask. I'm not far, she nodded, suddenly shy. Thank you for today, for everything. As she watched him ride away into the gathering dusk, Winifred was surprised to find herself looking forward to his next visit in a way that had nothing to do with leatherwork or practical assistance. Lucas Xavier had somehow breached the careful walls she'd built around her heart without her noticing. The realization was both frightening and exhilarating. What she didn't know was that Lucas rode away with similar thoughts and a growing guilt about his secret role as her anonymous benefactor. Sooner or later, he would have to tell her the truth. But the right moment hadn't presented itself, and he feared her reaction. The more he came to care for Winifred Caldwell, the more difficult the confession became. June arrived with blazing heat that threatened the newly planted crops. Farmers and ranchers across the county watched the cloudless sky with growing concern. Winifred's garden wilted despite her careful watering from precious well reserves. Lucas continued his weekly visits, always with leatherwork that needed mending, though Winifred had begun to suspect he was manufacturing repairs to give her work. She didn't call him on it, however. Their meetings had become the highlight of her week, a bright spot in the lonely rhythm of her days. One particularly hot afternoon, Lucas arrived to find Winifred attempting to dig a shallow irrigation channel from the creek to her garden. She was red-faced and exhausted, her dress soaked with sweat. "Winnie, you'll make yourself ill in this heat," he scolded gently, taking the shovel from her hands. She didn't protest, which worried him more than her appearance. "The garden won't survive another week without water," she explained, her voice raspy from thirst. "Come sit in the shade," he insisted, guiding her to the porch. "I'll finish this." Too tired to argue, Winifred allowed herself to be led to the rocking chair Thomas had made during their first year of marriage. Lucas brought her water from the well, then removed his vest and rolled up his sleeves before returning to the half-dug trench. Winifred watched him work, admiring the easy strength in his movements. Lucas was a handsome man, she admitted to herself. Not in the flashy way that turned heads immediately, but in a solid, reassuring manner that grew more appealing over time. "You're staring," he called over his shoulder, amusement in his voice. Winifred blushed. "Just making sure you're doing it right." His laugh was warm and genuine. "Of course you are." By evening, the irrigation channel was complete, bringing life-giving water to the struggling plants. Lucas joined Winifred on the porch as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Thank you," she said simply. "Again." He nodded, comfortable in the growing silence between them. Fireflies blinked in the yard, and somewhere in the distance a whippoorwill called. "Beautiful night," Lucas observed, leaning against the porch rail. "Despite the heat." "It is," Winifred agreed, suddenly aware of how alone they were, how intimate the gathering darkness felt. She cleared her throat. "Lucas, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Why have you never married? A successful rancher like yourself must have had opportunities." Lucas was quiet for a long moment. "I came close once back in Texas. Emma was her name." He looked out at the darkened prairie. "She died of fever before the wedding. After that, I threw myself into work building the ranch, never seemed to find the right person again." He glanced at her. "Until recently, perhaps." Winifred's heart quickened at his words and the intensity of his gaze. "I see," she managed, uncertain how to respond. Lucas straightened, sensing her discomfort. "It's getting late. I should head back." "Yes, of course." She stood, strangely reluctant to see him go. Will you come again next week?" His smile was warm in the dim light. "Try and stop me." After he left, Winifred sat alone on the porch for a long time, her thoughts in turmoil. She hadn't expected to feel this way again, this fluttering anticipation, this awareness of another person that went beyond friendship. Thomas had been gone just over 6 months. Was it disloyal to feel this connection to Lucas? Or was it simply the natural course of a heart healing? Unknown to Winifred, Lucas was having similar thoughts as he rode home under the star-strewn sky. He'd spoken more openly than intended, revealing feelings he'd barely admitted to himself. The widow Caldwell had become important to him, more than he'd anticipated when he first left those supplies on her porch, and therein lay his dilemma. Each time they grew closer, the truth about his role as her anonymous benefactor became harder to confess. Would she feel betrayed when she learned? Would it destroy the fragile connection growing between them? The following week brought no relief from the heat, but did deliver a welcome surprise. Sheriff Taggart rode out to Winifred's homestead with news. "Got word of a buyer coming through next month looking for good leather work," he explained, accepting a glass of lemonade gratefully. "Told him about your saddles and such. He's interested in seeing what you can do." Winifred could hardly contain her excitement. "A real buyer from where?" "St. Louis, by way of Chicago. Outfits expeditions heading west." Taggart sipped his drink. "Could be steady work if he likes what he sees." This was the opportunity Winifred had been hoping for, a chance to support herself through her craft rather than subsistence farming. If she could secure regular work, the homestead might actually become viable. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said sincerely. "This could change everything." Taggart nodded, looking around the modest property. "Place is looking good, Mrs. Caldwell. You've done well here." "Not alone," she admitted. "I've had help, though not always willingly accepted." "Lucas Xavier?" the sheriff guessed with a knowing smile. Winifred raised an eyebrow. "He's been kind enough to provide work and occasional assistance, yes." "Good man, Xavier. Keeps to himself mostly, but always steps up when needed." Taggart set his empty glass down. "Interesting that he sought you out for leather work. Don't think I've ever seen him bring repairs to town." Something in his tone made Winifred pause. "What do you mean?" Taggart shrugged. "Nothing particular. Just that Xavier's got hands that can mend leather as well as any. Was known for it back when he worked cattle drives." This revelation startled Winifred. If Lucas was skilled at leatherwork himself, why would he bring her items to repair? The question nagged at her after the sheriff departed, adding to her growing suspicion that there was more to Lucas Xavier's interest than he had revealed. When Lucas arrived the next day, Winifred was waiting with fresh coffee and a determination to understand his motives. "Sheriff Taggart mentioned something interesting yesterday," she said as they sat at her kitchen table. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Oh, he said you're quite skilled at leatherwork yourself, that you were known for it during your cattle drive days." A flicker of discomfort crossed Lucas's face. "I can manage basic repairs, yes." "Then why bring these to me?" She gestured to the pile of leatherwork he'd delivered over the weeks. Lucas took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "You do finer work than I ever could, and I thought you could use the income." "So it was charity," Winifred said, her voice hardening. "No," Lucas replied firmly. "It was recognizing skill and paying for it fairly. There's a difference." She wanted to be angry but found she couldn't sustain it. "And the other help, the fence repairs after the storm, the irrigation channel." "That's what neighbors do," he said simply. "You do the same if positions were reversed." Winifred studied him, sensing there was still something he wasn't saying. "Lucas, is there something you're not telling me?" Their eyes met across the table, and Winifred saw conflict in his expression. For a moment she thought he might confess something important, but instead he changed the subject. Taggart mentioned a buyer coming through, for leather work. She allowed the diversion, though her suspicions remained. "Yes, next month, someone from St. Louis who outfits expeditions." "That's excellent news," Lucas said with genuine enthusiasm. "Your work deserves a wider audience. If he likes what he sees, it could mean regular orders." Winifred couldn't keep the excitement from her voice. "Enough to make a real difference here." Lucas smiled, clearly pleased for her. "I never doubted you'd find your way, Winnie. You're too determined to fail." The warmth in his voice made her blush. "I've been close to giving up more than once," she admitted. "But you didn't." "No," she met his gaze, "and I've had help whether I wanted it or not." Something passed between them then, a current of understanding and attraction that neither could deny. Lucas reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Winnie," he began, his voice low, but whatever he meant to say was interrupted by a frantic knocking at the door. One of Lucas's ranch hands stood outside, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Mr. Xavier, fire at the south pasture, winds pushing it toward the buildings." Lucas was on his feet instantly. "I have to go." "Of course," Winifred said, following him to the door. "Be careful." He paused, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'll come back when it's handled." Then he was gone, dust rising from the horses' hooves as they raced toward the Xavier ranch. The fire at Lucas's ranch consumed the next 3 days. Winifred heard reports from passing neighbors. A lightning strike had ignited the dry grass, and the winds had pushed it toward the ranch buildings. The entire county had turned out to help fight the blaze, forming bucket brigades and digging fire breaks. On the 4th day, when no word had come from Lucas, Winifred made a decision. Hitching her mare to the wagon, she packed food and clean clothes, then headed west toward the double bar. The landscape grew increasingly blackened as she approached Lucas's property. Charred fence posts and scorched earth told the story of how close the fire had come to the main buildings. As she pulled into the yard, several tired-looking ranch hands nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Caldwell," one greeted her. "Boss is in the barn." Winifred found Lucas examining a horse's burned leg, his own hands blistered and his face streaked with soot. He looked up in surprise as she entered. "Winnie, what are you doing here?" "What neighbors do," she replied simply, setting down her basket. "I've brought food and clean bandages." "You look like you could use both." For a moment, Lucas seemed about to protest, then his shoulders sagged slightly. "Thank you, we could use the help." Winifred spent the day tending to minor burns, preparing meals for the exhausted men, and helping Lucas assess the damage to his property. The ranch house and main barn had been saved, but he'd lost a substantial portion of grazing land and several outbuildings. As evening approached, Winifred realized she'd need to head back before dark. Lucas walked her to her wagon. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice rough from smoke and fatigue. It meant a lot. Winifred looked up at him, noting the new lines of worry etched around his eyes. "How bad is it, truly?" Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Could have been worse. Most of the herd is safe. We'll rebuild the rest." On impulse, she reached out to touch his cheek, her fingers gentle against his skin. "You need rest, Lucas. The rest can wait." He caught her hand, holding it against his face for a moment before releasing it. "I'll be by next week, as usual." "I'll be waiting," she promised, surprised by how much she meant it. As Winifred drove home in the gathering dusk, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. From resenting any offer of help to voluntarily providing it, from guarding her solitude to looking forward to Lucas's visits. She'd begun to open her heart again, despite her fears. What she didn't yet know was that the fire had crystallized something for Lucas as well. Watching Winifred move competently among his men, bringing order and comfort to chaos, had confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. She was the woman he wanted to share his life with. But before he could offer his heart, he needed to clear his conscience. The next week brought a break in the heat and the first honest rain in nearly a month. Winifred stood on her porch, watching the life-giving water soak into the thirsty earth, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted. Her garden would survive. Her chickens were laying well. And the leather samples she'd prepared for the St. Louis buyer were some of her finest work. As promised, Lucas arrived on his regular day, though earlier than usual. He looked rested, the worst of his burns healing. He carried no leatherwork this time, but instead a small wrapped package. "Morning, Winnie," he called as he dismounted. "Thought we deserved to celebrate the rain." She smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. "Indeed we do. Come in out of the wet." Inside, he presented his package, a small cake from the baker in town, a rare luxury that made Winifred's eyes widen. "Lucas, you shouldn't have. Why not? We've both worked hard." He removed his hat, shaking water from the brim. "And I have something important to discuss with you." There was a seriousness in his tone that made Winifred nervous. "Is everything all right? That depends on you." Lucas took a deep breath. "Winnie, there's something I've needed to tell you for some time, something I should have said weeks ago." Her heart raced. Was this a declaration of feelings? Or something else entirely? "I'm listening," she said, setting the cake aside. Lucas met her eyes directly. "I'm the one who's been leaving supplies at your door, since the beginning." Winifred stared at him, uncomprehending at first, then with dawning realization. "You, all this time," he nodded. "After Thomas died, I heard you were struggling but refusing help. I remembered what that was like after Emma died, how pride can keep you isolated when you need support most. So you decided to, what, trick me into accepting charity?" Her voice rose slightly, hurt warring with anger. "Not trick you," Lucas protested. "Just help in a way you might accept. And then I got to know you and it became harder to confess. I was afraid you'd resent me for it." "You're right about that," Winifred said, stepping back from him. "All these months you let me wonder and worry. You watched me struggle with accepting those gifts, never saying a word." "I wanted to tell you," Lucas insisted, "especially as we grew closer, but the right moment never seemed to come. And now it has." Winifred crossed her arms protectively. "Why now, Lucas?" He took a step toward her, then stopped when she tensed. "Because I can't keep pretending. Because what I feel for you is too important to have secrets between us." The sincerity in his voice made her anger waver. "What exactly do you feel?" "I love you, Winnie," he said simply. "I think I started falling for you that first day I saw you shouting at the empty prairie to stop leaving you gifts." Despite herself, a small laugh escaped her. "You were watching me from a distance." A smile touched his lips. "You were magnificent in your fury." Winifred shook her head, still processing his confession. "I don't know how to feel about this, Lucas. Part of me wants to throw you out for deceiving me, and part, he prompted when she didn't continue. She looked at him, this man who had gradually become essential to her happiness. "And part of me understands why you did it, because I know how stubborn I can be." Relief washed over his features. "Does that mean you might forgive me, eventually?" "I'm still angry," she admitted. "But yes, I think I can forgive you, in time." Lucas nodded, accepting this. "That's more than I deserve. I'll go now, give you space to think." As he turned to leave, Winifred found herself calling after him. "The cake! You forgot the cake." He looked back. "It's for you." "Stay," she said impulsively. "We might as well share it now that everything's in the open." They sat at her table, the rain pattering against the roof as they cut into the sweet treat. The conversation was stilted at first, but gradually relaxed as they worked through the revelations of the day. "How much have you spent on me, all told?" Winifred asked finally. Lucas looked uncomfortable. "I didn't keep track, Lucas. Not much. Things I could spare." She shook her head, both exasperated and touched. "I will repay you, every penny." "If it makes you feel better," he conceded. "Though I'd rather you consider it a gift freely given." Winifred studied him across the table, seeing him with new eyes. "You're a good man, Lucas Xavier, even if your methods are questionable," he smiled ruefully. "I'll take that as a compliment." By the time he left, the air between them had cleared somewhat. Winifred still had processing to do, but her initial anger had faded. What remained was a deeper understanding of the man who had become so important to her, his care, his respect for her independence even as he tried to support her, and beneath it all, the knowledge that he loved her. That revelation would take the longest to fully absorb. The days leading up to the St. Louis buyer's visit were busy ones for Winifred. She worked tirelessly on her samples, determined to present her very best work. Lucas kept his distance, giving her the space she'd requested, though he sent a short note inquiring after her well-being. When the day finally arrived, Winifred dressed in her best dress, arranged her leather goods carefully, and waited nervously. Mr. Hollister, the buyer, arrived punctually, a portly man with a discerning eye and brisk manner. "Mrs. Caldwell," he greeted her. "Sheriff Taggart speaks highly of your craftsmanship. Let's see if his praise is warranted." For the next hour, he examined her work meticulously, asking questions about her techniques and materials. Winifred answered confidently, her knowledge evident in every response. Finally, Hollister nodded with satisfaction. "Exceptional work, Mrs. Caldwell. I'd like to place an initial order for a dozen saddle bags and 20 sets of reins. If the quality remains consistent, we can discuss a standing arrangement." Relief and joy flooded through her. This was the opportunity she'd been praying for: steady, respectable work that would allow her to maintain her independence. After Hollister left with promises to send the formal order by post, Winifred stood on her porch, watching his buggy disappear down the road. The future suddenly looked brighter than it had since Thomas's death. Her first thought was that she wanted to share the news with Lucas. The realization gave her pause. Despite her lingering hurt over his deception, he was the person she most wanted to celebrate with. What did that say about her feelings? Late that afternoon, Winifred made her decision. Hitching her mare to the buggy, she drove to the double bar. Lucas was working in the corral when she arrived, and the surprise on his face when he spotted her was evident. "Winnie," he said, approaching the buggy, "is everything all right?" "Better than all right," she replied, unable to contain her smile. Mr. Hollister placed an order, a substantial one with promises of more if he's satisfied. Lucas's face lit up. "That's wonderful news. I knew he'd recognize your talent. I wanted to share it with you," she admitted. Despite everything, he nodded, understanding the significance of her gesture. "I'm honored you came. Would you like to stay for supper? My housekeeper makes a fine stew." Winifred hesitated only briefly. "I'd like that." Over the meal, they talked easily about her new business opportunity, the recovery from the fire, and the changing season. It wasn't until they were seated on Lucas's porch afterward, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, that Winifred addressed the elephant in the room. "I've been thinking about your confession," she said quietly, "about why you left those supplies anonymously." Lucas turned to face her. And I understand it better now. You were trying to help without hurting my pride." She met his gaze. "It was misguided but well-intentioned." "It was," he confirmed. "Though I should have been honest sooner." Winifred nodded. "Yes, you should have. But I've realized something important in these past days apart." "What's that?" "That you've become essential to my happiness, Lucas Xavier." The words were difficult to say, but she pushed through. "When something good happens, you're the first person I want to tell. When challenges arise, your support makes them bearable." She took a deep breath. "I've fallen in love with you despite my best efforts not to." Joy transformed Lucas's face. "Winnie," he breathed, reaching for her hand. "I never dared hope you might feel the same." "Neither did I," she admitted. "After Thomas, I thought that part of my life was over. And now," she smiled, squeezing his hand, "now I find myself looking forward rather than back. For the first time in a very long while." Lucas brought her hand to his lips. "I love you, Winifred Caldwell. And I promise no more secrets between us." "I'm holding you to that," she warned, though her eyes were soft. As the first stars appeared above them, Lucas and Winifred sat together, talking of possibilities and plans, the future opening before them like an unwritten page. The weeks that followed were busy for both of them. Winifred worked diligently on Hollister's order while also maintaining her garden and chickens. Lucas continued repairs on his fire-damaged ranch while making regular visits to the Caldwell homestead. Their relationship deepened, built on a foundation of mutual respect and growing affection. Lucas was careful to support without overwhelming, mindful of Winifred's fierce independence. For her part, Winifred learned that accepting help didn't diminish her strength, but rather allowed her to direct it more effectively. By late summer, when the prairie grasses had turned golden and the evenings grew cooler, Lucas began bringing up the idea of marriage. "We could combine our properties," he suggested one evening as they sat on her porch. Your land adjoins mine at the eastern corner. Together we'd have one of the largest spreads in the county. Winifred considered this. Is that why you're proposing, for the land? Lucas looked horrified. Of course not. I'm proposing because I love you and want to build a life with you. She smiled, having known that was the case but wanting to hear him say it. I love you too, but marriage is a big step, especially for a woman who's grown used to making her own decisions. I wouldn't change that, Lucas assured her. We'd be partners in every sense, your leatherwork, my ranching, both essential to our success. The idea was appealing. Together, they could create something greater than either could accomplish alone. And there was no denying the joy Lucas brought to her life. I'll consider it, she promised, which was further than she'd gone in previous discussions. Lucas seemed to recognize the concession for what it was. He kissed her hand, his eyes reflecting the setting sun. That's all I ask. What Winifred didn't tell him was that she'd already largely made up her mind. She was simply waiting for the right moment, a moment that would belong entirely to them, untainted by past sorrows or struggles. That moment came unexpectedly the following week. Winifred had completed Hollister's order ahead of schedule and was preparing to take it to town when Lucas arrived unannounced, his expression serious. Lucas, I wasn't expecting you today. I know. He dismounted, leading his horse to the hitching post. But I found something I thought you should see. From his saddlebag, he withdrew a burlap sack similar to the one he'd first left on her porch months ago. Winifred raised an eyebrow questioningly. Open it, he encouraged. Inside, she found not supplies but a beautifully crafted leather journal, its cover tooled with an intricate design of prairie wildflowers. It's beautiful, she breathed, running her fingers over the detailed work. Open it, Lucas repeated softly. The first page contained a handwritten note, for Winifred, who taught me that pride can be both a shield and a bridge. Let these blank pages be filled with our story, one we write together, as equals. With all my love, Lucas' tears pricked at Winifred's eyes as she looked up at him. Lucas. He took her hands in his. I'm not good with fancy words, Winnie, but I know what I want and it's a future with you. Will you marry me? Not because either of us needs saving, but because together we're better than we are apart. Winifred felt something settle in her heart, a certainty she hadn't experienced since before Thomas's death. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. The joy on Lucas's face was all the confirmation she needed that she'd made the right decision. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and new beginnings. They were married in October when the harvest was in and the land prepared for winter. The ceremony was small but joyful, held in the Kearney church with friends and neighbors in attendance. Sheriff Taggart served as Lucas's best man, while Dorothy Harper stood up for Winifred. As they exchanged vows, Winifred thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from her desperate determination to survive alone to the realization that independence didn't preclude partnership. From Lucas's anonymous gifts to his open declaration of love. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister declared, and the small congregation erupted in cheers. Later, at the celebration held at the Double Bar, Dorothy Harper approached the newlyweds with a knowing smile. I suspected Lucas was your mystery benefactor months ago, she confided to Winifred. Saw him buying extra supplies at the store right before things would appear at your place. Winifred laughed. You might have told me, and spoil his courtship strategy? Never, Dorothy winked. Besides, you needed to figure things out in your own time. As the evening progressed, Lucas pulled Winifred aside for a private moment. Happy, Mrs. Xavier? Very, she assured him, still getting used to her new name, though I'm keeping Caldwell for my leatherwork. I've built a reputation with that name. Wouldn't have it any other way, Lucas agreed, his arm around her waist. Your work is yours alone. She leaned into him, grateful for his understanding, but the rest, the ranch, our future that belongs to both of us. A fair division, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. As their guests began to depart, leaving the newlyweds to begin their life together, Winifred reflected on the strange path that had led her here. From the depths of grief to the heights of new love. From desperate independence to chosen partnership. "What are you thinking?" Lucas asked as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching the last wagon disappear down the lane. "That sometimes help comes in unexpected forms," she replied, "and that pride isn't always the best guide." Lucas smiled, drawing her closer. "And sometimes the things we resist most turn out to be exactly what we need. Like mysterious deliveries," Winifred teased. "Like stubborn widows," he countered, his eyes warm with love. Together they stood, watching night settle over their joined lands, the future stretching before them not without challenges, but faced together as equals, as partners, as love had intended. 3 years later, Winifred sat on the front porch of their expanded ranch house, watching Lucas teach their 2-year-old son Thomas to ride his first pony. The little boy's delighted squeals carried across the yard as Lucas led the gentle animal in a circle. "Not too fast," she called, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Their second child was due in just a month, and Lucas had become even more attentive than during her first pregnancy. "We're being careful, aren't we, Tommy?" Lucas called back, winking at his son, who nodded enthusiastically. Winifred smiled, contentment washing over her. The double bar had prospered under their joint management. Her leatherwork business had expanded beyond Hollister's expeditions to include custom orders from as far away as San Francisco. They had built a workshop for her beside the house, where she could work while keeping an eye on their growing family. Life wasn't perfect. There had been droughts and blizzards, cattle disease and market fluctuations. But they had weathered each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. As she watched her husband and son, Winifred thought about how far she had come from those dark days after Thomas's death, when pride had been her only companion and stubbornness her sole strength. Opening herself to help and to love had been the hardest and best decision she'd ever made. Lucas looked up, catching her eye across the yard. The love in his gaze still made her heart skip, even after years of marriage. He lifted Tommy from the pony and headed toward the porch. "I think someone's ready for his supper," he said, setting the sleepy boy in Winifred's lap. "And a story." Tommy asked hopefully, snuggling against his mother. "Of course," Winifred promised, smoothing his dark hair so like Lucas's. "Which one would you like?" "The one about the proud lady and the secret helper," Tommy requested, as he often did. Lucas and Winifred exchanged amused glances. They had crafted a child-friendly version of their own story, which had become their son's favorite bedtime tale. "Once upon a time," Winifred began, "there was a very proud lady who thought she could do everything all by herself. And a kind man who wanted to help her," Tommy continued, knowing the opening by heart. "That's right," Lucas said, sitting beside them and placing his hand gently on Winifred's belly where their second child kicked vigorously. "And do you remember what happened when the lady discovered who had been helping her? She was mad," Tommy declared with a giggle. "But then she wasn't, because she loved him." "That's the most important part of the story," Winifred said softly, meeting Lucas's gaze over their son's head. "Love makes room for both pride and help, for independence and partnership." "And they lived happily ever after," Tommy concluded with satisfaction. "Yes," Lucas agreed, leaning in to kiss his wife tenderly. "They certainly did." As the sun set over their thriving ranch, painting the Nebraska sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Winifred Xavier knew that their happily ever after wasn't an ending but a continuing journey, one filled with challenges and joys, hard work and tender moments, pride and humility, independence and mutual support. It was a journey she wouldn't trade for anything in the world.